Hello, welcome to the Varn blog. We're today talking about this book. This is my handy dandy thrift books edition. Given its fading, I think it might be like a late 80s, early 90s printing of the book. This one, a lot of Lasch's books I've discovered are really easy to find on ebook. I mean, legally, but really hard to get a decent paperback copy if they're not Culture of Narcissism, The True and Only Heaven, Haven in a Heartless World, and Revolt of the Elites. Like all the ones that I think are important are kind of hard to get.
Yeah, I think I paid $75 for my copy of American Liberals and the Russian Revolution, which I'm sure I could have gotten someplace cheaper had I been a little more willing to go out. But it does speak to how impossible it is to find so much of the good stuff.
Yeah, that was the one book that my co-author and I, Shallon, when we originally talked, we're like, oh, we don't need to talk about that book. No one talks about that book. And then I read it and I'm like, we fucking need to talk about that book. It's actually really important. It makes the questions that come up in New Radicalism, The Agony of the American Left, and
World of Nations.
World of Nations. All make more sense, actually, like why those figures are so key, why he goes back as far as he does. Also, Shallon will also think I'm crazy about being really insistent. Lasch talks like a Marxist, except when he talks about the working class. And when he talks about the working class, I kind of think I know what he's talking about, but then I don't. And people also talk about him in terms of PMC discourse. And I think you and Daniel Tutt turned me on to the fact that this was a biographical fact that I just missed. That not only did he know Ehrenreich, but he was almost in a political party with Ehrenreich in 1968. So him not using the PMC construction is not an accident. He definitely was aware of it. I think you found writing where he even mentions why he doesn't use it.
Yeah, and then he goes into some detail at the end of, we talked about this on the last podcast, so refer back, listeners. But in the last chapters of Progress and Its Critics, he talks about Ehrenreich specifically. He also uses the term professional managerial class at the end of Culture of Narcissism, and then says there is no difference between the managers in the corporate class. What I'm referring to with professional managerial class is a style of management, not the creation of an independent class, which is about as clear cut as you can get
that's
the PMC thesis.
Right. Well, to me, when we talk about the PMC, it's a mode of discourse that affects, Anglo-Saxon liberalism. And I guess it is more specific than liberalism because liberalism is so pervasive. I'm reading Raymond Geiss's book on how not to think like a liberal, which I think is a memoir, but I think it's brilliant. But it gets into a lot of the same stuff actually from a different direction. I don't know if he mentions Lasch. I haven't finished. He might, but he definitely mentions Lester McIntyre and all those people who Lasch, has a troubled association with because he ultimately rejects communitarianism. But from what I can tell, everyone called a communitarian who is an Israeli rejects communitarianism. Michael Sandel will accept it, but very reluctantly. Lester McIntyre's no, I'm an Aquinian, and I'm well, sure you are, buddy. I mean, yes, but also no one's you can't bring back the epistemological and moral assumptions of Catholic France in the late medieval period to court and it make any sense. That's the part, actually that's the part of McIntyre's project that I just where I feel like it kind of jumps the shark, because I'm yes, you can try to revive a virtue tradition, but you can't revive the entire milieu that produced that virtue tradition, even from a religious standpoint, like much less from like my kind of like historical context, material incentive standpoint. Like that world is in some way alien to you, even if you want to resurrect it through text and whatever. And I think that's part of the tension. To bring it back to this, I think that's part of the tension in Lasch, because his norms seem to be, well, how do we deal with the psychic devastation? Let's go back to the way that this was handled in earlier societies. And you've been reading Civilization and its Discontents, and you pointed out to me that if you kind of read what Lasch is doing, he's taking what Freud and even most Freudians considered weak and going, yeah, but like religion kept these tendencies in check through, myths, communal balance, modeled virtues, the assumed petty bourgeois and artisan aesthetic, etc., and ethic. And to me, that's all, like that to me, and it becomes clear to me when you talk about his 88 Cocoon essay that I bring up all the time. And Sean's like, why do you find the essay so important? It's like, because he talks about working class traditionalism, and I feel like he's inventing it to court, like as something that he needs to exist as a psychological model, because he's also dissatisfied with the way Marxism has gone by the 1980s. And that's really clear because he thinks Marxists have come up with all these categories that show contempt for the working class. Now, he doesn't mention this or seem to know it, but the categories that are used, like false consciousness, are actually not from Marx at all. But he's just like, well, that project's clearly not going to be helpful anymore, and I don't know if it's because of the specific brand of Trotskyism he was arguing with at the time or what, but that's definitely there. So to bring us to minimal self, which I keep on playing with my categorizations of Lasch's work, because I think the first 4 books are clearly like the cultural history of the problems of the American left is understood through some key debates and figures, right? Like some of which are obscure to us now, some of which are really, really not, some of which have become oddly prescient again. I mean, like Lasch's frenemy status with Michael Harrington is all of a sudden kind of important because the DSA is a thing. And when you read that 1969 essay about Harrington, you're just like, I think it's in World of Nations. He's got a chapter about Harrington in World of Nations and a chapter about Harrington in the agony of the American left. And both of them really feel like they hit home now. And what I find funny about that is like the content of the Democratic Party has objectively changed in a lot of ways. I mean, the black vote being more and more aligned to it, that's a consistent thing from that time period. But every other major constituency of the Democrats is either almost entirely modern. I mean, by modern, I mean contemporary, or it's actually losing key supported demographics in the past, like Sun Belt petite bourgeoisie, lots of sections of the workers, etc. I don't think the Republicans got those sections of the workers. I think they mostly just depoliticized, and that's like where most of the non-voting gap comes from. But
yeah, I think there's one component of that which is interesting to me, which is that Lasch singles out. He talks a lot about the in the last chapter of Agony of the American Left, the possibility of like combining the Kennedy and McCarthy campaigns, and uniting, the promised left-wing electoral coalition since the New Left, which is like left liberal voters of conscience with minorities and students and organized labor. And that's still the strategy because each of those groups still exists and exerts like combined basically an aggregate influence on the party. It's just that like labor has shrunk massively and the left liberal voters of conscience have increased in the past couple of years because of the suburbanization and embourgeoisement, I don't know how to say it, of the party. And so the strategy remains the same.
I think that's true, except when you look at the high end strategy. Like, so who are the elites? Not like the PMC level elites. I mean, like the real power bases of the Democratic Party's money. And that is interesting to me because until, say, around the time Lasch is talking about, New England is Republican and New England old money is strongly tied to the Republican Party. I can't tell where it's tied now. Like, I feel like it's tied in both parties, actually, that they've just like completely hedged their bets. I'm increasingly of the thesis that the bourgeoisie in America has largely depoliticized and doesn't even care. But
I know like some people in that who could be described as like New England old money, and they're Republicans until 2012 and Democrats post 2016, but not particularly fervent Democrats. They just cut the checks and then stamp the ballot, or I guess punch in on the computer the ballot for the Democrats, but they're not into it necessarily. So you're completely right about that.
I feel like I also see this to some degree with even some of the suburban areas we talk about. I tell people, like, okay, you tell me that the Democrats won Georgia because of the expansion of suburban power. And I think you're right, except that it doesn't go down ballot at all. Like, it doesn't translate down ballot, whatever. Okay. So then what is that telling me? Well, it tells me that in local interest, there's still it's a small group of people. I want people to understand that, but it's a decisively small group of people in like the Atlanta suburbs and in Warner Robins and in the richer areas of Georgia that basically split their national and local political allegiance. Like, they're locally Republicans for whatever reason, and they're nationally Democrats. And it's actually had an interesting moderating influence on a political lizard like Brian Kemp, because Brian Kemp, yeah, I think it's his name, Kemp, because it seems pretty clear to
you can just leave it.
It seems pretty clear to me that, like, they have realized that they can maintain some of those voters for the local party by not following national party trends and stunts. Now that's interesting to me. That actually is sort of like it is like the inverse of the Dixiecrats, who adopted, I want to remind people, the Dixiecrats adopted neoliberal policies before it was cool, even for Republicans. Partially based off, I think, racial protectionist logic. But the Dixiecrats were the same. Like, they were, for example, Georgia started swinging for Republicans in the national election in the Bob Dole campaign in '96, and it had been leaning kind of Republican going all the way back to Reagan, nationally, but locally those same people were Democrats, and so that shift for that demographic took about a generation. Now, what does that tell me about what we're dealing with? Like, I constantly think about, like, Lasch's conceptions of, like, who the parties are, of the, the psychological types of parties, right? And there's always problems with that kind of modeling. But I kind of look at today, like if we like who's the party of the id, who's the party of the super ego, and who's the party of the ego. And I know he only uses some of those terms. And I'm like, I actually can't tell anymore. That's that both parties, even as highly partisan as they are, and as highly ideologically rigid as they are in some ways, both parties have all three forms in them now.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's not clear for me to point out like who are the burn it all down guys. Well, there's some of both parties again. What I also find interesting is, and this is, I think, where the change in the PMC thesis discourse comes from, but I think Lasch actually does see this, is the kind of self-interestedness and lack of community seems to be manifested. I was thinking about, this is actually Culture of Narcissism, but I was thinking about like the Jerry Rubin, Abby Hoffman chapter of Culture of Narcissism.
Oh, I love that chapter.
Yeah.
He's so mad.
You know, and what's funny is he's actually like, he says good things about the people think Lasch. I've heard Daniel say Lasch had utter contempt for the New Left, and I think but in large parts he did. However, he does point out that like there were thinkers in the New Left who did try to deal with the problems, but the leadership, or at least the popular leadership, the Abby Hoffmans and the Jerry Rubins, just ignored it, right? Like,
well, he mentioned, I mean, he thinks they're operating from like the faulty assumption that is central to the culture of narcissism in politics, which is that like image equals reality. And so the focus of Rubin in particular and Abby Hoffman is that politics is theater. So just provoke these violent altercations between the New Left and agents of the state, which will demonstrate to everybody how unbearable the state is and turn people against it. But it
this
wound
was
up,
the logic of Occupy and parts of BLM too. Not gonna lie.
yeah, and it wound up identifying the state as much more powerful than it was until like the New Left was basically at war with a selection of phantoms. And I do think I don't remember Occupy, but I definitely think that BLM could be described this way a little bit, considering that it was identified as simultaneously like a radical movement of the edge and also the largest peaceful protest movement in American history.
Right.
It was a
Which
movement.
I don't know. That's an assertion that I'm always like, I think that's technically true, but I don't feel like it's probably
I don't know if it's politically
true.
Yeah.
Like what I mean by that is like part of that's just the law of the larger size of the population.
Yeah, no, exactly. It's like when people are like, more people voted in this election than ever before. Like it's like
until
growing.
Until now, until like very recently, the population's been growing.
Yeah, but I mean, what I do think is significant is that the focus is on and remains in many ways politically on image rather than substance. Though I do think there's some movements away from that. Like I think that both Trump and Obama were to a large extent defined by image. In Obama, the image of the first Black president, the post-racial presidency,
and the outsider president, even though even though Adolf Reed called him in 1996, but
yeah.
like he read even to someone like me. So I can tell you my response during that campaign, and because I was 28 years old, right? So like, I just come back after being too right wing for the Republican Party, not right wing enough to be an actual fascist, but somewhere in that very uncomfortable
fascist.
Yeah, well, be careful with that, man.
In America.
But what I would tell, my response was, okay, I supported a quote real outsider candidate, even though he'd been in office before. I supported Mike Gravel. Um, because while I'd always like had some vaguely Kucinich as sympathies, I'd always thought he was a loser. Like, and I don't mean that in like that he had bad positions or was a bad guy, but like he could never rally like more than like point something percent of the Democratic Party vote. I had never voted for a major party until that election ever. I've been a third party voter. I mean, I'd only voted in 2 major elections at that point, but they were significant ones. They were both the Bush ones. And I remember trying to get myself, like, as an anti-war conservative, being willing to vote for John Kerry, and I just couldn't. So
You voted for a rock, so that makes it a little hard.
Right. I was just like, I can't do it. Like, I don't believe his anti-war credentials. Well, what would I, where would I go? And so I think I voted for Nader or something, which so Democrats can blame me for forever for all their losses. But except I was in Georgia, so they can fuck off. So I guess my point about that though is like, even to me, after Gravel went on his weird Quixote campaign into the Libertarian Party where he got crushed there too, I was like, well, what's the least harmful candidate I could throw my hat behind? John Edwards is gone. People forget about him. He was the most populist of the three. I can't support Hillary Clinton. I think people forget this about Hillary Clinton, but in that campaign, she also tried to run as a folksy, like, representative of Arkansas and the white working class in the union vote. And I think people completely forget this. And Barack Obama, she tried to portray as, the white liberal hoity-toity candidate. And then that is erased from history, like the moment he takes the nomination.
Do you know what I found out, which is also related to Lasch, is that Andrew Sullivan wrote an article in The Atlantic in 2008 entitled "Obama, a Laschian Conservative."
Yes. Yes, I do remember that, because in the justification was that they were both really into Reinhold Niebuhr.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this was a time period. The thing that people forget about Obama is that he was a cipher for like everybody who had any problem with anything that happened in the Bush years, which was pretty much every fucking body. Like, the American conservative flirted with supporting Obama. Neil Ferguson, the British imperialist apologist / neocon, openly endorsed Obama. He turned against him very quickly, but openly endorsed Obama in 2008. There was this massive sea change. That's when Fukuyama like cuts from his conservative past entirely. That really happens under Obama. And I find it funny, actually, because I was talking to the Regrettable Century podcast people on our co-show. And by the way, 20 minutes in, Elijah and I are going to have like bi-monthly, by that every 2 months, Lasch discussions, so you know. Probably should have announced that at the beginning. But
you can have like a flash on the screen. Maybe. I don't
know. But I find it interesting because Lasch had never completely fallen out of the discourse, but he was portrayed in the aughts unequivocally, except actually by some of the libertarianish conservatives, which is interesting, but unequivocally as at least highly sympathetic to conservatism in that decade.
What's so funny, I mean, I think that Lasch kind of like he gets folded into a lot of different movements during the time he was alive.
Mm-hmm.
And so he gets folded in, obviously, to the New Left because he was an actual member of the New Left. Then he gets folded into the critical theory response to the failure of the New Left because he was responding to them. And then by the end of his life, he gets folded into communitarianism, which itself, I think, was subsumed in large part into the Third Way. And Obama was the second coming of the Third Way.
Right. I think that's an important thing to say. But what's interesting is that we also have communitarians. By the time you get to Obama, have split. There are the conservative communitarians, of which there aren't many in the U.S. Actually, they're
Republic guys, sort of.
Yeah, those guys. I also think there's a lot of them in Israel, like Shlomo, Etzioni's people. Then there are the Charles Taylor communitarians. They're all liberals, right? They're liberal communitarians, but they defend a liberal tradition. They defend personal authenticity. There's Michael Sandel, who's really hard to place because he's a big civic republicanism guy, early republic. We at least have to consider it, but he's also the most suspicious of markets and meritocracy, and he really dislikes the Republicans after 1980. And he's even more difficult to place after in his Obama and post-Obama era books, as I'm reading them right now. His the Morality of Markets book and the Tyranny of Merit book, where he's explicitly going after both the Republicans and Barack Obama. But he actually makes the same observation you just did, that Barack Obama and Trump are different reactions to a sclerotic insiderness. It's just that Barack Obama, as soon as he'd won, and in a way that a lot of people who were exuberant about his identity didn't really notice, reestablished the Clinton era bureaucracy as an act of hey, I'm going to play as an insider, which I remember when that happened vividly. Again, 28, so it's more live memory for me. I was 28 then. For those of you listening, I am definitely not 28 now. I remember phone banking for Obama. Only person I ever canvassed for, to say that, and outside of Gravel. So once I basically handed my skills off to, and the moment he started announcing who his cabinet was likely going to be, I felt like I had been betrayed. So by the time he won, I was no longer excited for my vote. And that I was really early on that. A whole lot of people who were very excited about the Obama campaign, and I feel like if I had taken Lasch more seriously, and it's hard to do in a moment, I would have seen the same response that a lot of people probably had to the early Kennedy campaign happening at that time period, right? I do think there's a real parallel between Obama and Kennedy, and that Kennedy was also an image president. He's also a cipher.
Yeah, and Lasch writes about that extensively in The Culture of Narcissism.
Oh yeah,
Kennedy is Lasch's least favorite president by far, which is why I think it's so funny, reading a lot of Lasch at the current moment when Kennedy is kind of being rehabilitated for basically no reason.
He's being rehabilitated, and also rehabilitated for everybody. I got the one time I've been ratioed on Twitter, right? And this is for all the horrible shit I've ever done in my life. I got ratioed for this, saying that structurally, some of the leftist conspiracies about John F. Kennedy being secretly sympathetic and dropping his anti-communism are structurally identical to the Bircher conspiracies that he was chief globalist, but he was killed because he realized the globalist conspiracy. And people were like, Birchers never thought that. And I just started pulling out like Bircher pamphlets after his death. I'm like, oh, yes, they did. After Kennedy died, he was a cipher for everybody. We had a whole generation of baby boomer obsessives about this because this is like one of the prime things in their childhood, in the way like 9/11 and maybe is in yours or something. I'm too old. I was already an adult when 9/11 happened. So, and what I find interesting, and I, maybe I would love to hear. This is one time where I saw like I wish Lasch was still alive, because like, tell me the ways in which the millennials are the weird, bizarro mirror image of the boomers, even in the way they approach things like conspiracy theories. And what I mean by that is not that they're the same. Like the conditions are so different. Like the boomers come up on the tail end of the most prosperous wave of American history that's ever existed ever. It doesn't last very long, but they are able to ride it out. It starts depleting immediately. I mean, if people go back and read articles as early as like the early 90s, they're talking about how Gen Xers don't have anywhere near the wealth of baby boomers, and that's just now increased in its predictability and probability for generations. For mine, I guess I'm between Gen X and millennials, so for both of mine and for yours, and both of yours, because I guess you're between Z and
I'm solidly in Z, I think.
Okay. How old are you?
I'm 22.
Oh yes, you're probably a Z. I was thinking you're like 27.
No, I'm sorry. Tried my best. No, I'm. I mean, I think that there is, well, one element of this is the people raising millennials are like early boomers, and my parents are Gen Xers. And people do implant their experiences secondhand onto their children. And that, for me, is one reason why millennials do appear to be, in many ways, the mirror image of boomers. But
well, to me, Zennials are Z's seem like, and yes, you can scream "Okay, boomer" at me. It's okay, even though I am somewhere between. I am the other kind of Zennial. I'm the X Zennial, not the Z Zennial. That in some ways I relate to Gen Z more than I relate to millennial, even though I'm technically kind of that generation. But younger millennials are like more foreign to me. I'm like, you guys are weird. You grew up with Tumblr. I don't know what you're about. And people go, these are advertising categories. In a way, that's true. But I think there's very massive technological changes in these generations that really do influence things.
I think one element of this is if you're experiencing kind of like mature technologies. So like boomers are experiencing the not like television in its kind of like infancy as a mass article.
Yeah, and the spectacle is still shiny.
Yeah, suburbanization is like a mass category.
Gen X is the spectacle as ironic farce that no one believes, but they all still partake in.
Yeah. Television becomes ubiquitous. Suburbanization becomes the norm.
Internet 2.0 for my generation is still shiny, and it was, I will also say, markedly different because it was not commodified.
And I think for millennials, the internet was like still kind of like a frontier.
Oh yeah.
And for people my age, the internet,
is like, making you illiterate.
Well, it's not making me illiterate. It's making lots of people illiterate. But it's a mature object. It's been like cordoned off into these very selective online spheres dominated by a handful of companies. It's not exciting. It's not shiny. It's not adventurous. It's not exploratory. It's something that you're used to.
Although it isn't different to think about the nature of the shock of the transition between these technologies a little more, because TV has always been dominated by just 3 or 4 conglomerate companies, and it seemed for a while during the next period that maybe we gotten past that, but it immediately collapsed back into it. fast enough that people of the same generation could see it.
Mm-hmm.
The internet really was, particularly when you think about the only reason we had it is because the guy who came up with the World Wide Web did not patent it.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's, the internet's infrastructure is all from DARPANET and ARPANET, which is all, public security infrastructure. It's based off of cybernetics technology that was developed simultaneously by the US and the Soviet Union and Europe all together. It really wasn't, interestingly, a capitalist enterprise, but it was very beneficial because it created a lot of new markets. I think we are literally living through, in the last 10 years, the consequences of its commodification. And yes, I joke about literacy, although I'm serious. I really can't think of any other thing. Like when people tell me the social ills, and we talk about, say, depression amongst young women, or decline in literacy, and I'm like, they're like, well, the schools suck. I'm like, but the schools have sucked forever. Yes, they suck worse, but like, honestly, I'm not sure beyond primary education how much effect that has on literacy. Like most people's, we know if somebody's going to be highly literate generally by the time they're in middle school. There are exceptions to that. This is aggregate stuff, right? I'm not, like, your middle school self is not your fate, but aggregately it is. And the only thing I can see is, like, there was a shift in the nature of the technology from text to video.
Well, I think Lasch has a chapter in he talks about this a couple of places. So there's, I think, 2 chapters which come to mind. There's schooling in the new illiteracy.
That chapter is fucking amazing.
It's great.
Also, I read half of it to the channel just to point out to people that what we went through in this last cycle of school wars literally already happened almost verbatim in the 1950s.
And it happened again in the second chapter I'm referencing, which is the decline of democratic debate chapters and the decline of third places chapters in Revolt of the Elites, which I think are some of the better parts of the book, personally. And which talk about, like, the PC wars in the 90s, which also are the same thing as the PC wars now.
I was about to say, PC wars to call out culture wars to cancel culture wars, they're literally the same thing.
Yeah.
The difference, I think, and my vulgar materialist explanation for this, more people have gone to college, more people couldn't get jobs or got kind of crappy jobs, more people started blogs and TikToks with very low levels of introductory college levels of theory, which then exploded out and got vulgarized in the discourse, because that's going to happen. Anything that's not even bad, it's just a natural tendency of things. And so the PC wars, which was very much a media and academic culture only thing in the 80s and 90s, like, is now a general cultural war. Like, yes, there was always a general culture war, but, like, it was a joke to everybody. Like whether or not you were liberal or conservative in my small town in Georgia, we all made fun of PC people because that's what snooty academics do. No one really cares. Like, if you're a Democrat or Republican, if you're not a snooty academic, you're not going to worry about this. We all know that, like, that we should be less hateful. We were crappy at it. I'm not going to lie. like, God, I mean, anyone from the 1990s, which I think from the Gen Z perspective and from even the younger millennial perspective, is often portrayed as like this reactionary hellhole. And I'm like, that's because it's like the transition area, like the 70s were, because basically the 90s pick back up the cultural debates of the 70s, almost like lifted them directly out of like 1976, but in a completely different context of like a mature television and a generation of access to birth control and stuff like that. So And it's not that there was none of that in the 80s. Like, I was watching Golden Girls and actually like noticing culture war topics in Golden Girls episodes, including having openly gay characters who are not portrayed unsympathetically in 1987. But in general, that's weird. Like, that's that's the one show that got away with it somehow. I'm still not sure how it got away with it. So basically the Reagan Revolution like stalls all that for a decade. Like, I think the Reagan period's why we think of like horror movies as inherently conservative, for example, because like all of them during that time period are a little bit reactionary. Even the ones that were directed by like notedly left wing or liberal directors. So I think that's an interesting thing to notice, right? And I think that's interesting in this book because you and I, I think what you and I wanted to talk about this because I said that I thought that what Lasch would categorize the current society as is total psychic devastation. I think you kind of think that what's going on is more complicated. But if we were going to use like Kohut's narcissistic typologies or Erickson's narcissistic typologies from like mid-century American and British psychoanalysis, which one of the problems that I think people have with Lasch and psychoanalysis now is the left tends to read Freud and then it tends to read like Lacan and French stuff. It doesn't tend to read the British and American psychoanalyst unless you're a professional psychoanalyst. So like people aren't reading
on.
Right. They aren't reading Kohut, Klein, Erickson, Reef, etc. Leftists are occasionally reading people like Russell Jacoby and Richard Sennett, who are also pulling somewhat indirect. Jacoby not so much, but Richard Sennett somewhat indirectly from that same cohort of psychoanalysts. But if you're looking for like Lacanian frameworks, or if your introduction to psychoanalysis is like modern Zizekianism, this is going to feel utterly alien to you. And it also, I do think it's a lot like Freud, but it's not like if you're taught Freud and all you're ever taught is the really weird psychosexual stuff that everyone obsesses over, like Oedipus and Electra complexes and stuff like that, then this also doesn't feel like it says anything to you at all. Like, because that's not what Lasch thinks is going on, even though, yes, separation anxiety, primal alienation, and all that is part of Lasch's thinking. I think he's Daniel Tutt disagrees with me, but when I read this book, I feel like there's a whole lot of terror management theory in this book. But maybe I'm wrong about that. What do you think? This book being the minimal self.
Yeah. I think that the thing I'd like to focus on in that is the distinction between total psychic devastation and something else more complicated. Because a lot of this is just an outgrowth of that, like, what's the prediction within the minimal self as best as we can take it? In terms of, like emotional management, the minimal self appears to be a strategy for managing the possibility of psychic devastation.
Right.
And it's a slightly different strategy than the one he talks about in The Culture of Narcissism. And for me,
narcissism, he's talking about secondary trait narcissism. Right?
Exactly.
Let's define that for people and like where that framework comes from, because that might help them.
So there's a mythical aspect of this, which is great as an analogy that Lasch goes into, where he talks about Prometheus and Narcissus, who are brothers who have led us down the same path, in his words. Prometheus is this type of secondary narcissism. It's an identification with the grandiose, with the all-powerful, and an equation of the self to the all-powerful.
Yeah, and then when you take that specifically through Erickson, that means identification with the firm, because you are identified with the great work of your corporate overlord, more or less.
And this is how this is reliant on the political economy of the Fordist era.
Right. Totally.
Narcissus is different. Narcissus is a folding in of the self to the outside world, where Prometheus is the exertion and the imposition of will on the outside world. Narcissus is, he dies in the Greek myth because he can't recognize the distinction between himself and the water. It's not that he's in love with his reflection that matters. It's that he's physically unable to tell where he stops, where he ceases to exist. And this is often thought of as, in narcissism, it's like an expansive thing, but it's actually the opposite. It's a shrinking of the self. In the case of Narcissus, he's physically shrinking because he's diving into the water and it's overpowering him. And this is the type of narcissism that Lasch is discussing in The Minimal Self.
Right.
And it's one that I think is much more important and viable today. And I think a great example of this is in technology, where we were talking earlier about how there's this possibility of adventure for the boomers and for the millennials and the respective technologies in their time. And then for Gen Xers and Gen Z people, this is not viable anymore because the organization of these technologies is so powerful, is so all-encompassing, that there's no longer even any viable pretense of control. It just is your environment to be in these technologies. And one thing that the internet allows is it allows you to fold yourself into technology more effectively than any other type of technological innovation we've ever made. You can become your online persona, where all of the hours of a day you spend at your computer, you can be somebody else. Of course, it's mediated and controlled by an external force. It's not actually within your control. And so it amounts to the renunciation of self as a means of warding off psychic devastation. And I think that this strategy is increasingly compelling as a way of avoiding psychic devastation, but it's not necessarily effective, as we were talking about earlier with like the decline of literacy, increasing anxiety and depression on the part of young people. Because what you do recognize is that you're ceding yourself to the world. And there are plenty of times when you can't fold yourself into the world because, you're a person, you have to eat, you have to sleep. There's very obvious examples of the limitations to your control, which you think about even as you're pretending to be somebody else or pretending to be a particular version of yourself through the mediation of outside technologies and forces. And so minimal selfhood is a strategy that's simultaneously impossible to accomplish without destroying you and extremely compelling.
Right. Because there's a kind of like emptiness release that comes with it, right? Like there's this freeness of association, no need for the public and private boundary. Like, I mean, I find it interesting, for example, that one of the most talked about psychological terms that everyone, and it's a radical shift that I saw happen literally in a decade, and it was a decade I was gone. So I really I felt like I left on one psychological trend mode and came back in another. And in the aughts and in the late 90s, everything was like radical honesty, radical transparency, etc. Now, in a time period where like one of the things I always think about your generation, and it's not fair, but it's also kind of fair, is like I can be in someone's house and people will start streaming me without thinking about it, which there's a certain amount of Gen Xer in me that's like, that's a shooting offense.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you have violated my inner sanctum, you cretin. And there's another part of me that's like, well, I've grown up on the internet. I'm actually a public figure. I get why people might do this, but they don't just do it to public figures. Like, I'm just like, and I've seen all these things where people will like turn their dating life into like TikTok reels where they're literally performing something. And there's a lot. I don't want to say that that's like a morally bad thing to do. I actually told someone when I was responding to this, I'm like, because people like to hate on this when it's made too obvious, right? You get on the internet, someone does this, some poor like 22-year-old woman does this thing when live streams like the ends of her dates, doesn't betray anyone's, identity, doesn't really talk shit about anybody, but it is very sitcom-esque, and you'll see like the 5-minute internet hate at her. But I kind of figure what that was about is like, oh, she's making the game too obvious, and we resenting her. Well, some of it's probably a little bit of misogyny too, but we're resenting her particularly because it made the game that so many of us are playing really, really obvious. And the only difference that I think is generational is that for someone like me, this game is not something we have played all of our life. It was not like, I remember watching 8th Grade, that movie written by Bo Burnham about middle school girls, and it made me like terrified for every middle school kid that I've ever dealt with. And I was like, oh, that's why they don't bully each other anymore, at least not in public, because the consequences to bullying for everyone involved are astronomical because everything is seen all the time. And so I don't even want to say that this is entirely negative, right? I don't actually think it's that simple.
That example fits perfectly into like a lot of what Lasch discusses, where like narcissism is created, is inculcated in the post-war generation as the culmination of the social engineering process meant to eliminate conflict in the world and transform American society into a cooperative society. Basically, like it's the psychological equivalent of the creation of corporatism,
right?
Which is the goal of American liberalism up until the 1970s, and to a certain extent now again.
I think about like I do point out that like when someone like Adolf Reed talks about like, well, most anti-racism is like for elites to be able to get along, I'm like, yeah, but it's also for like, it's also so people can feel like they're addressing justice in society, not fall apart. Like, and it's not to sing the praises of liberal anti-racism, because I think it's actually becoming pernicious in the way that it is currently manifesting, because it's even more blatantly than in the past a symbolic enterprise. If you just look at stats, like gains that were made between the 50s and even the 1990s are being lost in almost every key racial demographic. The exception is the elite is not nearly as white, and that is because of changes of immigration policy in the 1980s. Like, that's not even because of like people moving up from the, Latin and Black, working in semi-lumpenized classes. It's because we've let people of certain class backgrounds come here and take up that position here, as the baby boom apparatus kind of dies down. I mean, and I think I'm not against that. This is not something that I think is actually, super bad. I don't think it destroys the character of America, because I don't think, one, I don't so much care about the character of America, and two,
the character of America has already been destroyed also.
Right.
Like,
yeah, exactly.
That was the point of the post-war economy, was to make the character of America obsolete.
Well, this is this is a long way to getting back to tying this into Sandel, because I've been reading so much of Sandel and I find it very useful, but there's stuff missing in Michael Sandel that I think is very telling, that Lasch speaks to. So Sandel talks about the shift from civic republicanism into the neutral administrative state. And in his most recent version of Democracy Discontent, he picks up on something I have also picked up on. And like we've entered since 9/11 a state of perpetual crisis justification, which I point out, like, yeah, but the administrative state transition was also done in the state of perpetual crisis, that crisis being actually bigger, not than the climate crisis might be, but than things currently are, which is Spanish flu, World War I, World War II, Holocaust, Great Depression. I don't know. Well, I mean, like, how many of them do you need? Like, and the incorporation even before the liberalization of say, like, educated work visas,
Mm-hmm.
of so many different, even just white groups in the country. So, like a civic republicanism that had a set of, say, WASP and maybe concessions to the German and the Scotch Irish and Irish, and later on the Italians, um, as a values group, it requires the state to seem more and more neutral. I actually am a believer in the thesis, we talked about this last time, that the civil rights legislation turning into the civil rights Warren Court was an attempt, when that wall of legislation was hit, to still handle this transition without it breaking out into more violence than it already did. And we have to remember that the 60s and 70s, I remember all these fucking boomers. Now I'm going to sound like yelling at the old people, but everybody I knew who was older than me, some of whom were alive in the 60s, were telling me, like, this is the worst time in American history for solidarity during the Trump years. And I'm like, you were alive in the 60s. Do you remember how many political figures were assassinated in like 10 years? Like, an astronomical amount. Chicago and parts of Atlanta were burnt down. Like,
It is kind of remarkable how, like, there's a lot of violence in American life, but how little
always
political violence there is. Like, there's not assassinations, there's not, these like guerrilla groups that existed in basically in the 60s and 70s.
We haven't had like a 20,000 bomb campaign that happened in the 70s.
No, we haven't. And it's
those bombs killed remarkably little people, actually, but still, the fact, I don't know what the United States would do if, like, we were having bombings every other day.
Yeah, like, January 6th is like the height of political violence in America, basically in certainly my lifetime.
Right, and I think mine too.
Really. And 6 people died.
Oh, no, I take that back. The height of political violence in my lifetime, other than 9/11, which was an outside attack, was the Oklahoma City bombing. Yeah. And the fact that there were a whole string of bombings during the 1990s that, like, we forget about because they weren't particularly successful. Like the Olympic Park bombing in Atlanta, which didn't kill anybody. The first World Trade Center bombing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I actually think we even.
I also do want to clarify, there have been, like, several mass shootings which have been clearly motivated by political violence, but have not had the large scale, like, image of January 6th, which was, similar to the image of political violence in the 60s and 70s, which was, like, assassinations were a massive, like, media outpouring, and defined the relationship of Americans to, like, their idea of their country. And that's not the case with mass shootings, where, like, we identify these lone actors. But it is the case with things like political assassinations and January 6th, where, there's a perception that this is in some way a dark reflection of American life. And Lasch talks about this in his chapter on Oswald as everyman, in The True and Only Heaven, where he goes into the fact that, like, Oswald's attack on Camelot seemed to indicate a hidden capacity for violence in the whole of the American people. Which is, I don't know how hidden it was, but
I would say that those kind of statements, I'm like, yeah, if you don't consider, I don't know, lynchings.
Yeah, like, no, there's a lot of examples as to why, like, this is kind of like a preposterous thing to wake Americans up, but, like, this is an argument he makes, and I think it is true that we like to imagine that we're a much more peaceful people than we actually are.
I think my pushback on that is I also have seen the converse, is where people like to imagine America as a much more violent place than it actually is.
Yeah.
Because their comparisons are like the richest parts of Europe, and then they're only looking at gun violence. It's like, uh, you know, at one point in the this is no longer true to give Russia its due. That's going to be taken out of context, but during the in the early aught teens, Russia's murder rate was higher than the US's, and it was just with knives. Like, it was just like, it's like, come on, man. There is a way in which the United States and liberal reporting about the United States only ever compares it to the OECD, and more power to them. But there's a lot of ways in which we aren't like the rest of the OECD.
We're an entire empire unto itself.
Right.
Like it's very weird that West Virginia is in the same country as San Francisco. Like, just as like a geographic fact. And it leads to America having like this enormous differentiation between different states and different regions in their relationship to the American empire, basically.
Right. I mean, it leads to weird stuff like all the people in your state talking about all the people in the state I'm from being moochers because we take more tax money, and then we go like, well, yeah, but you take all of our stuff.
Is that true of Utah? I don't think that's actually
No, it's not true of Utah. It wasn't actually true of Georgia either, but they used to say it to me. I forgive you for being a New Yorker. I forgive most of my audience for being New Yorkers. Just so people know, I'm aware that the two biggest media markets for Varn Blog are New York and Seattle.
It's really funny that Seattle is like much higher than California then.
Oh, I don't. You know what's interesting as a side note, and I'm going to keep this in, but it has nothing to do with what we're talking about. I don't have hardly any listeners from Atlanta. All right, now I get not having listeners from Macon, a dying former mill town in the South, is not gonna like the three people there who listen to it like know me personally, I'm sure. But I don't have many listeners in Atlanta, and I don't have many listeners in San Francisco, which is funny because San Francisco is the only part of California that I've ever had any ties to.
Mm-hmm.
Like, my second wife had a family from the Bay Area, and my best friend is from the Bay Area. One of my two best friends is from the Bay Area. I have no audience there. I have a larger audience in Reykjavik and Oslo than I do in San Francisco.
Maybe all the San Franciscans who knew you moved to Reykjavik. No, I'm joking.
Yeah, well, it's possible. Or maybe like what I have to say, like maybe there is truth to this California ideology thing that I used to throw away. I do have a listenership in LA, but only LA, not San Francisco, which I think it says something to me about, even when we talk about like the coastal elites, and I'm going to apologize to my LA listeners. I think the character of the people of LA is quite interesting, but LA is objectively a hellhole.
That's why that's like the entire reason that Adorno and Horkheimer's culture industry is the way it is.
Right.
It's actually just them going to LA and being like, we hate it here.
Like, I don't blame you. like the people there are cool, but I think it's like I have been to few more places that feel more dystopian if you're like a pedestrian, like, or if you're not. So,
do you remember there's a section in the end of The New Radicalism in America where Lasch is talking about, like, he's contrasting America and France. And he's like, in France, the cultural apparatus and the political apparatus are in the same city. But in America, they're divided between, DC and New York. And like reading that now, the cultural apparatus has in many ways,
divided itself,
and gone to LA. And so if distance is what we're measuring, then the distance between the production of culture in the United States and the political apparatus is like so wide as to be like completely inconceivable.
What is funny about American culture in this sense is like literary culture still is pretty much a New York, Chicago thing. It has stayed in its traditional like 19th, early 20th century hubs. But popular culture, broadly speaking, moved to LA, and if we're honest, now it's in like Atlanta.
And Florida.
Like, yeah. So it's just like it's like, and what you're seeing is like, so now LA is like the legacy of the legacy media of the newish mid-century media is still there. It's just gotten what you just notice is like our city hubs divide. Um, and some people are like, yeah, people in Washington D.C. don't read, and I'm like, I don't know that like politicians in Paris read either. And I can tell you there are downsides to being an empire with that centralized of a city. If you've ever like it, the I'm gonna say something that'll probably get me in trouble in progressive circles, but the idea that we would keep the states the same, but then get rid of like all federalism for direct representation really would lead to this country like splitting apart, like almost instantly, because I'm like, yeah, no one's gonna like. There are more people outside of California and New York than in them, but those two areas would like totally dominate our politics otherwise. And we already kind of. I say this as a person who actually loves New York. Um, I used to love the Bay Area, but I really do think it's like a mixture between a tech dorm and a shopping mall now, with a lot of homeless people. But I say this as a person who loves New York, but when I didn't have exposure to New York, and my exposure to New York was like New York intellectuals coming to my college, right? I hated you motherfuckers, because like you would lecture us on like what it meant to be worldly, as like, I'm from New York, I'm from a worldly city, and I'm like, you've never left your borough and you don't know what people are like in your own country. Go home, stay in your borough, you provincial motherfucker. Like, which I don't feel that way anymore, but I kind of do. Like, all right, but
for the record, most of the people who like never leave New York and stay in their boroughs are like the 35% or 60%. I forget the number of like foreign-born, like poor immigrants.
oh yeah,
I had a friend from Queens who had never seen the ocean until he was like 18.
So what I realized who I was actually yelling at was a mixture of Manhattanites and Brooklynites.
Yeah, they can be very annoying.
And Long Islandites, who are like, they have actually left the borough, but they don't want you to know that. So, and they don't want you to know that they're from Long Island either. So like, it was an affectation, right? But it was also like people from Cleveland who come down and lecture Southerners about how racist we were because there was a black bar and a white bar and people didn't intermix, and I'm like,
New York is like the most segregated school system in the country.
Objectively it is, actually.
Yeah.
One of the ironies of the civil rights legislation and the way that the court rulings affected like integration is only the South had to deal legally had to integrate.
The county structure, because Southern schools operate on like a county-wide basis, but Northern schools operate on a school district or village basis.
That's not legally why, though, because if we did that in the South, the Supreme Court would step in, and the federal government would say you have to redraw your lines.
That is the legal reasoning. I'm serious. That happened. There were two different decisions about busing, one in the South that made busing happen, and one in Detroit where they permitted it to like not happen in the same way because of the differentiation between countywide and like village school districts.
Right. But the logic for why there could be two rulings in the first place, you trying to be a lawyer and know this stuff, was that there was special scrutiny on former Confederate states.
Yeah.
Put stricter scrutiny on claims than in northern states.
Yeah.
Which is, which is to me ironic, because it basically meant like, well, we don't talk about segregation in the North, but Detroit, Chicago, and New York are super segregated. And when you add the New York testing school thing into it, it even got worse. Like, so it was, Yeah, I know that. I mean, obviously, the people who I was yelling at had left the borough; they were in Georgia. Um, Part of, I think, that the interesting thing that you have to deal with America and Lash's interesting because I don't think he deals, except when he talks about Mormons, weirdly, with like how, and a little bit on race, but he seems to assume America has more of a monoculture than I think it actually had during most of the time he's writing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's kind of explained by the fact that he like left, what was it, Nebraska, and then he
Mm-hmm.
went to Harvard, and then he went to Columbia, and then he stayed in the university for the rest of his life. Um, and there is very little cultural difference between Harvard and Columbia, definitely.
Absolutely. There's very little cultural difference between the elite Americanized parts of. Man, I talked about this once, and people got mad at me because it sounded like I was like one of these right wing populists. But I was like, look, when I was teaching at an American school in Egypt, it's gearing people to go to very elite colleges in Europe and the United States and Canada. They had more cultural overlap with like rich Americans
My
than I did in the South. Like it was kind of crazy.
It's and that like is continuing in these weird ways. Now the culture war is getting globalized in these like completely insane ways. So my friend David just released a piece on Palladium in Palladium magazine where he went to like interview the Taliban, and they called one another like soy jacks and listened to Andrew Tate while playing like Counter Strike, and like complaining about having to be bureaucrats and not being able to like fight in the mountains and have fun anymore.
Oh, I read that. It was like, oh my god, it was real funny. Terrifying actually in some ways.
Yeah, it's horrifying.
But I noticed it when Europeans, for all that, like this, I noticed this about 10 years ago. Europeans had more anti-American sentiment than even I was used to. And I'm used to Europeans being anti-American. I get it. We stole their empire. They're pissed about it. They want to get all moral about it as a justification for their resentment. I understand. But the weird irony is these people who were complaining about America were no longer doing it on European terms.
They're doing it on American
They're
terms.
doing it on American terms with American categories, which they then also try to apply to their own culture in ways that make no sense.
There was this protest in Berlin that got a lot of coverage in 2020, where it was like a decriminalized sex work protest. And sex work in Germany had been decriminalized since the 1980s.
Yeah, I was actually say sex work is not criminal in Germany.
Yeah, and so it was like just like a protest outside of the American embassy against the German government using American terminology to address an issue that does not exist in that country.
And for those of you who just think this is a left-wing thing, our conspiracy spread all over the goddamn world.
Yeah, QAnon is everywhere.
It's just like, and I'm like, QAnon's like the new Mormonism. Oh, I shouldn't say that where I live, but like, it's like people are adopting this highly Americanized like myth system that doesn't even make sense in their context. It's just, and I find it interesting. I find it interesting for a variety of reasons because I actually do think one of the ironies of this whole multipolarity period is American cultural hegemony doesn't seem to be going anywhere.
No.
Like it's like, if anything, it's being. I remember really thinking about this when Macron started complaining about American critical theory like ruining French universities.
Le wokisme.
Yeah, and I was like, oh, that's funny because most of our intellectual justifications from that came from you. But then I was like, yeah, but we did reframe it totally in our own racial divides. And the way we talk about those divides make it sound like, I know that we always say they're socially constructed. That's like always the asterisk at the bottom. But we talk about them as if they're universal concepts that apply to the entirety of the world. And it's crazy to me. I think, to tie this back in, I do think that's a symptom of some of what Lasch is talking about, though, in this self-minimization, because public-private character and public-private distinctions require actually a fairly strong sense of self, even if you're masking it, and a rootedness in place and time.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the thing about Lash's conception of the self, which he talks about very explicitly in the Minimal Self, is that questions of culture are questions not of taste or of like erudition, which is like the culture industry framing of it. Basically, it's like people are being debased, people's taste is lowering. It's a question primarily of technology and of control. And the thing about American economic hegemony and the construction of like a truly globalized system is that American technologies are universal. And the same cultural effects are popping up in every country that has access and is defined by the technologies that are emanating out of Silicon Valley. Um, and so it doesn't surprise me at all that the culture is developing to be more and more of a monoculture. Um, and that people are getting captured by the things that get the clicks, the things which are able to spread like a virus across the internet. I guess I will, like QAnon, for example. It's universal because it's reliant on a particular technological ecosystem, which now exists in every country in the world.
Although what I find interesting, I've gone back and forth from whether or not I think it's the pandemic or whether or not I think it's interest rates that is pushing back on this, because like social media use is declining, like generally. And I think in every platform but TikTok. And who knows, both Republicans and Democrats are talking about a war on TikTok. So it's hard for me to know where this is going, because I was thinking about this the other day. I was like, well, what happens if this entire media ecosystem that's about like all these quasi sociopathic streamers that exist, what happens if they just don't have an access tomorrow? I have no idea. Like, I also, in the similar way, like if someone had said that we were going to turn off TV overnight in 1992, I would have no idea what that would have done to the culture. Like, so it's a similar kind of thought experiment. The one thing about TV, for all its mass spectacle, it was more or less nationally bounded. I remember, like, spent a little bit of time in Canada as a kid, not a lot, but enough to know that its TV culture was different than ours. Like,
they don't have Hulu there still. There's
what?
no Hulu. There's no Hulu in Canada.
I think in most of the British Commonwealth. Interesting, there is Hulu in South Korea, but nonetheless, there are some differences, but those differences are less and less. Another thing, when I lived in Korea, and this was only 13 years ago, I left Korea a decade ago. All right, I was there for 3 years. The idea of like edgy Korean cinema, that was in movies, but the idea of that being TV shows like Squid Games, that was impossible to imagine, because both of regional culture and Korean specific legislation makes that kind of show illegal. But the internet was not factored into their legal structure. I don't know if Netflix censors it in South Korea, but I doubt it. Because I just think it wasn't like, yes, there's explicit laws banning pornography in South Korea. But like South Korean television's highly edited, but not on Netflix. And so like a lot of people now have this conception of like Korean edginess, because they also know movies from 20 years ago, which again did not have the same regulations. Now they did. I think there's a lot of other Korean cultural products coming on, but one of the interesting things about them, as I pointed out, like K-pop, used to, like 20 years ago, as a very specifically Korean phenomenon. K-pop now is literally, even more than American music, like it takes trends from all over the world and like almost algorithmically trains people to mimic multicultural trends. So this will have elements to appeal to all kinds of different cultures, which is I think as far as generic pop culture goes, is great. I actually don't think it's a bad thing, but it's just something to know that no, you're not actually learning much about Korean culture. You're learning about how
consumer demand.
You're learning about how Koreans are adapting specifically to worldwide consumer demand.
And you can see this in like other things within music, like the differentiation and tonality in American songs has declined to be like much more within like a specific set of octaves. Like there's less differentiation. I don't know my music terminology, so I apologize.
But I know exactly what you're talking about though. Like
and then the length of songs has shrunk and like the focus on hooks has increased. And this was a response to the rise of the movement away from records to CDs to
when they started including YouTube plays in the way you calculate the top 40 is when that really took off. And when TikTok came in, it's like solidified.
Well, that's what I was going to say. It's like TikTok now, it's like, can I make a song that's 20 seconds long? Like it doesn't matter. Like it could be.
It might be 3 minutes long, but we're only going to listen to 20 seconds of it.
2 minutes, or is 20 seconds. And you see this like now, and like Meghan Trainor is getting a lot of hate online because she released a song which is apparently very bad, but is like calculated to be a hit on TikTok. And I think all of this stuff demonstrates that the technologies we choose to include in our cultural production has a massive effect on consumption and on culture as a whole. And Lasch discusses this in great detail in The Minimal Self. He starts talking about, at one point, Ivan Ilyach's idea of the radical monopoly exercised by a particular technology over another one, where he's using the example of the car, Lasch's, and how it superseded subways and public transportation in the US, even for uses to which it was obviously unsuited, such as commuting back and forth from work. But in like terms of cultural production, there's a radical monopoly of TikTok over the radio, over just like Spotify at this point in certain ways.
One of the things that I find interesting in Lasch, and I'm going to get pushback from this, but there's only Lasch and then the British Marxists and the cultural British Marxists, Raymond Williams, Stuart Hall, to a lesser degree, E.P. Thompson.
Who are his favorite Marxists?
Yes. For one, they write just as clearly as Lasch does. God bless them. Having read a whole bunch of Baudrillard in the last couple months, and people think I'm going through this Baudrillardian turn. I actually find Baudrillard fascinating for how much he gets right, but also how spectacularly wrong he is at certain points. Because probably people like, I have some friends who actually think Lasch and Baudrillard are related, and I actually think there's some truth to that. But like I'm just reading the Agony of Power, and Baudrillard's claiming in 2007 that capitalism doesn't matter anymore. There are no more recessions. Class is really kind of abolished. There's only stimulation and simulacra. And I'm like, it's 2007.
Wow, that's
it's like if you just like had if you were looking ahead at all the way you were looking at in the 90s, you would realize that everything you're saying is bullshit right now. Like it's just like fascinating. And it was published in America in 2010, and it didn't get a lot of pushback. And I'm like, what's that about? Like, there's just stuff in it. There's stuff that's said in that book that is objectively wrong.
I feel like there's one reason Lasch holds up so well is because he makes so few predictions.
Yes.
He's like not very authoritative actually, which is the reason why he can be twisted into like anything, but also the reason why he retains a very strong relevance. So I often compare Lasch to both like Guy Debord and Foucault on like one side as like antecedents who are writing in like kind of like the early years of Lasch. And then on the other side to Mark Fisher actually, who I think is, because I think, a lot of these thinkers have a similar focus on like the relationship between spectacle and history and the perception of history, especially Foucault and Fisher. And in many ways, Lasch holds up the best because his view is like, yeah, there's ideological domination of the perception of history, but history just keeps on chugging along. Whereas like in capitalist realism, there's, like neoliberalism is very consciously framed as like the Hegelian like endpoint of human civilization. It like accepts a lot of like the Fukuyamaist framing.
Yeah.
And that is not a good prediction to make
That's
because
also why milquetoast reformism is like the only thing that Fisher can actually imagine. For as radical as his critique of culture is, if people actually looked at what, particularly right before he died, what politics he actually advocated, it was like Russell Brand and Jeremy Corbyn and anyone who saw any problems with that, he was casting and win with his culture war vampires.
Yeah.
And I just remember, like, I responded to that at the times, like, that's bullshit. Like you're literally, conflating. One, I think like he does something I think Lasch actually does too. I have no problem with valorizing elements of worker life and the working class. I got no problem with that, but I do think you have to be honest about his pathologies. I don't always think Lasch is.
No, I don't think he does them very well.
Right. I think like his vision of the working class seems to be the vision of the working class of his father. Because he seems really confused about, like, he sees the issues actually, and he states the issues very well and how they're affecting the working class, but he almost seems confused as like why they would be like he on one hand, I think he's rightly pushing back against the tendency of parts of the Frankfurt School to just discount the working class as no longer mattering, or as even as reactionary. And the authoritarian personality is like the perfect example of this. And that, my thing about the authoritarian personality is like, even like it's the one attempt the Frankfurt School does in sociology that was using objective sociological methods, and you look at it and you realize it's a mess and it's wrong.
And Lasch writes The Culture of Narcissism in response to it to disprove it.
Right.
And also then talks about it as proof of the like bankruptcy of the civilized minority in True and Only Heaven. It's his least favorite book.
Yeah, I mean, he takes but I think it's interesting because what I was getting at is Lasch's understanding of the cultural industry is better than the Frankfurt Schools. And yeah. I'm going to get in trouble for that by certain friends of mine, but I think that's actually, I think it's objectively true. And the only people who come close to him are the British cultural studies Marxists, Raymond Williams, Stuart Hall, etc. Like nobody else is really doing that. The problem that I have with Lasch, though, on this question is like, he does see the degradation of all of society, and he kind of acknowledges it's a problem for the working class, but he doesn't think it affects their character at all. And I think that's weird.
Yeah. Well, what he wants is, he thinks that psychology is very strong, basically, to both the credit of the mind and, to its danger, right? So his middle books and even his end books, they're all about how like psychology has, or, the control of the psyche has led us to act in certain ways. But as a result, one of his solutions is like, well, you have the ability to change your own perception of the world. And so if you just like focus on adopting a Judeo-Christian grind set, then you'll be able to recapture the moral ethic associated with the discipline of work in a way independent of its defense of property rights. And you'll be able to capture the positive elements of self-defense that narcissism is seeking to do.
He almost seems to think that you can retro-engineer the Protestant work ethic and the spirit of capitalism.
Exactly.
Exactly. Like,
exactly. That's a great way to put it. And I think he's simultaneously right and wrong about that. Like, I do think individual people have the capacity to do that. But if that's your solution to the problems of culture writ large, it's not going to work.
It doesn't. Yeah, my thought immediately is like, yes, that might be a viable lifestyle for an individual, but it doesn't a political philosophy make.
Yeah.
Like
It's the reason why he was so able to be folded into the third way, actually.
the
Um,
third way with Barack Obama, but he's also folded into paleoconservatism. He
yeah.
gets folded into everything.
It's folded into everything because like so many little aspects of what he's asking for can go into everything. But
Let me tell you something that Andrew Hartman, the Marxist, reminded me of on Facebook today. Just it's funny. He showed the picture. Do you the second Rage Against the Machine album? If you flick on the back, there's this like the spread of radical books that they were apparently reading at the time. And you get like Franz Fanon and there's anarchists and Marxist Leninists and all kinds of stuff in that book. And I actually, as a very young teenager in the zine culture, used it as kind of a reading list. But you know what book? There's two people in there that just stick out like a sore thumb to us now. They have Culture of Narcissism, the green label, the green one that like the one I grew up with, and it's my first copy, and Henry Miller are both in that stack of books. And it's so weird that like in 1990s, like I mean, I'm not even sure Lash is dead yet when this is coming out. I think
1984, he died.
yeah. So he just died. All right. But Rage Against the Machine, of all people, who like had positive portrayals of Shining Path in music videos, had Lash in their recommended reading list on the back of the cover for Radicals. At the same time, paleoconservatives are like wetting themselves to try to reclaim him. Like that happens fast. Roger Kimball like tries to like take Lash into their arms as soon as he dies and can't resist it. Like, and I just find it interesting because there's something about Lash that both faded away for a long time. I mean, Lash's popularity is much greater now than it was during most of the time that I was coming up, right? But he's also been considered part of all these kind of political traditions since almost immediately after his death. Like, if Zach De La Rocca can put you on the back of an album cover with like Angela Davis, Franz Fanon, Chomsky, the Anarchist Cookbook, etc., which I'm sure would make Lash uncomfortable because they're almost all the new leftists he was complaining about in
He'd
some
definitely
ways.
rather be there, I think, than in the paleoconservative reading list.
But yeah, then you go and see like Roger Kimball trying to claim him as soon as he dies. Like in the new Criterion. That is so wild to me. There's not many figures in American life. I mean, Henry Miller I mentioned because Henry Miller was nothing like Lash, but he's another figure like that. That like everybody, well, until very recently, everybody tried to claim. Now we're all just trying to pretend he never existed. But
I mean, I think that one thing that speaks to is like this. Lash talked about this relentless mining of the past, basically, and the dependence that American capitalism had on traditions that preceded it. And he's speaking of religion. But I think that like Lash basically he's really focused on America, which is this like country premised on reinvention and constant development, but also on cannibalization of the natural environment and the things that came before, including immigrant groups and indigenous people. And I think our politics have this really cannibalistic character. So I talked about the way in which the central promises of the Bernie movement were cannibalizations of the promises of the Fordist era. So it's a Green New Deal, just, it's the New Deal. It's Medicare for all, off Medicare. And in the same way, like Lash offers this great opportunity for cannibalization, where every single political orientation is trying to snap them up as quickly as they can and as well as they can. And nobody has quite managed it because he's so complex and because he seems to, on the surface, contradict himself a lot, though I don't think that's true. And the result is that you just have like very different Lashes that seem to exist, which we talked about on the last show.
There's the populist Lasch, there's the anti-populist Lasch, and I agree with you. Like the more I've been wrestling the True and Only Heaven with his critique of left populism and the World of Nations and the Agony of the American Left, I kind of realized like he doesn't actually change what he's saying. He changes the importance of the focus.
Yeah. I mean, he does like, he also changes his own position where like he is lambasting in True and Only Heaven intellectuals who say that populism is justified only by its relationship to socialism and liberalism as a precursor of them.
Mm-hmm.
When, of course, like that's the historical narrative he's presenting in Agony of the American Left, that there's a history that goes from populism to socialism to the new left.
But what's interesting is he does see it as distinct, because what he actually thinks, like what he thinks is in that essay, the only time he really mentions FDR, which is which is kind of interesting, where he talks about like the Brahmin classes and how he became something else, and what he called the neoliberal. And again, neoliberalism here is not what we mean by it.
He's talking about the Kennedy administration.
Right. He's talking about the Kennedy administration, but really he sees that as born in a compromise in FDR. He seems to change his opinion on whether or not that was actually a good thing.
I think he likes FDR. I mean, he doesn't.
I don't think he likes him in his early books, but
I think he likes him more later. But I would like FDR much more in the 90s than I would in the 60s.
I was about to say, once you get to the 1970s and beginnings of neoliberalism, which Lasch did see coming, you're like, oh.
But what he appreciated about FDR was his willingness to accommodate the United States with the Soviet Union.
Yes, which he's very specific about, actually.
Which is a constant element, and he like hates Truman because Truman started the Cold War.
He basically thinks everything is downhill when Henry Rollins gets kicked out. Like it's just
exactly.
What I think is fascinating about that, I mean, is that he seems really ambivalent about LBJ. I mean, we know he hates JFK. We know he does not like LBJ, but there's elements of like there's just he's quieter about him actually than you think he'd be.
Like, LBJ is the most contradictory figure in like modern American history because he's like I've been reading the Johnson biographies, by the way, so I'm like very hyped to talk about LBJ.
Let's talk about LBJ. We got a minute.
He like is born into like this old like family of politicians. He winds up in like grueling poverty. He has these experiences where it's very clear from an early age that LBJ is simultaneously interested in like nothing more than power and also in helping others and helping the poor and downtrodden. And then like continually LBJ just like for most of his life while he's politically active, he's like awful, like truly one of the worst men in American politics on a personal and political level.
He puts Trump's like, and this I'm not referring to politics at all, but like when people look for Trump analogs, they can really only find two in American history. One is obvious, is Andrew Jackson, and the other is LBJ. But what is interesting about LBJ is LBJ admires FDR and Andrew Jackson. So
yeah. Well, LBJ was like, he was a New Dealer who Roosevelt endorsed in his like Senate race. And then he lost that Senate race because he like didn't cheat enough. Right. And then in the next Senate race, he just like bought it and completely cheated. And he had this compulsive need to brag about it, where like later a reporter came into the like White House, a hostile reporter during his presidency. And LBJ like gets real quiet and he's like, I want to show you something. And he takes him to the back room. And there's a picture of him and Lady Bird sitting next to a car with the box of stolen ballots. And he's like, look at that. That's how I won my election. He's the president at this point. Like he has this compulsive need to brag about like law breaking. And then at the same time, he produces like the greatest flowerings of like American liberalism in a lot of ways, like Medicare, Medicaid, the Great Society, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act. And then at the same time, he does Vietnam.
Right. The contradictory nature of Johnson is, I think, actually paralleled by the contradictory nature of Nixon. And there has been a lot of leftists who are rehabilitating Nixon because Nixon's like the last great Keynesian.
The same ones who are like, who love like, what's his name? The guy in Ro Khanna. And then
Yes.
Ro Khanna like tweeted out like, we got to be Bismarckian in this country.
Yes.
And that's just like, we love it, folks. We love it.
It's like, yes, that's what I totally want is like Bismarckian nationalism works out so well for people. Anyway. But yeah, Ro Khanna, let me put it this way. Progressivism in America must die. And Ro Khanna is why. Like, and I know I strike a lot of people as very off because I'm not an anti-electoralist. I'm not here screaming about third parties or anything. But I think the progressive movement in American life is a zombie that we need to choke in the bathroom and smash his brains out. Like
it's a zombie. What's fascinating about it is it's a zombie from like literally the Wilson administration. Like
yes,
zombie Reaganism, but zombie progressivism is so much more pernicious because it's like continually able to rejuvenate itself by like being like, we've created new things, therefore we need new technical expertise. Therefore we'll create more things. Like there's still a need for more progressivism. It's, just deeply tied up in like a complex society. That's the reason it evolved in the first place. And that's not
it. In the end of sharecroppers is what killed populism. As I think we talked about last time, the Lasch's failure to properly appreciate, though, that like, because he, in both his celebration of populism and his denunciations of it, he's so caught up in the way it's portrayed. And I'm like, can't we just talk about the fact the sharecroppers didn't exist anymore?
Yeah.
Like, and like William Jennings Bryan going over to the Democrats is partly because like their constituency just was beginning to not exist. It wasn't just like in Lasch's early books, is like they got paranoid because they had too simple of a notion of the way economics and politics works, which is actually true. But I think the reason why that happened is because it loses its robust base and thus can only resort to that.
Yeah.
Like,
I mean, you may have noticed that my favorite topics to discuss relating to Lasch are like his writing about the like 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. And then also like to a lesser extent, the 10s and 20s.
Right.
Actually don't talk a lot about the 1870s to like 1910s period because it's just like very mythical.
Yeah, it's part of this. I don't know if he thought he was myth building, but he was myth building. Like,
and it's even more apparent like the few places he tries to go into earlier stuff in so in The True and Only Heaven, his earlier stuff is like drawing on literally like Puritan preachers. And then in Revolt of the Elites on like elements of like the myth of Lincoln, such as the his speech where he extolled free labor at the like Illinois County Fair or something, which is like, I mean, it's significant in regards to Lincoln's feelings as a political figure, but it's not really descriptive of the whole of American life during that period.
no.
In the same way that like the culture of narcissism and the minimal self are descriptors of the experience of the whole of American life during the 70s and 80s.
You know what's interesting that he is good on from the time period that we're complaining about? He's actually one of the best writers of like feminism from like 1870.
Yeah, he is. Well, he edited even before he came out with the New Radicalism, the Social Thought of Jane Addams.
Right.
Put together a collection of her writing.
He's one of the people who points out, like, one of the things interesting about him is because people always, if people accuse him of Heron folk socialism, it's always like, okay, you've never read what he has to say on race because he actually respects the Black nationalist movement and the civil rights movement, my friend.
Yeah.
But The other thing that I find interesting about him, though, people come at him on gender, and I think sometimes not wrongly. I mean, there are positions that he took that I understand the logic that why he took them. In fact, like the World Women's Organization took some of the same positions as him, like against no fault divorce, which, objectively speaking, is a bad call.
Mm-hmm.
Like the murder of women has dropped dramatically since no fault divorce. But that said, I do. Shallon's the one that pointed out that the WHO, the World Women's Organization, had the same position as Lasch to me when I was like, it seems kind of sexist, right? But I guess from the time period it was not recast that way by feminists until the 1980s.
Mm-hmm.
What I find interesting about him, because I do think he's got like again in the 88 on the 88 Cocoon articles where he talks about family, is like he really seems clueless about. He's very up on the anthropology of the family until the 1970s, but he just is not interested in it about even earlier anthropology on family units before that. Mm-hmm. Which is kind of how he gets like, well, the bourgeois family is like the normal mode of the family, and it's always been the mode of the family. I don't know what you're talking about. Shut up. And like, that's wrong.
Yeah.
But he's really good on like, hey, the feminists that have been recuperated by the progressive movement and forward are not the most radical feminists. They're actually the conservative ones.
Mm-hmm.
And he's dead on about that. But he, after the Haven and Heartless World, he just doesn't write about that much. Like, did you ever read the essay? It was in one of the Society for Cultural History by a modern feminist scholar who basically just called them a concern troll.
Like, I don't know if I read that one. I might have like scanned through it. I definitely did not read it in depth.
I read it and it was like I was like, wow, this is the most charitable reading I've ever read. But I think what I would say is his late writings on the family in particular, because, you know, this is where I have some personal like knowledge about him. He's very much in the family life. That is where like some of the charges of conservatism, I think, kind of stick.
Mm-hmm.
And he doesn't have an answer. Like in his debates in that Cocoon series, his responses to the Trotskyist is devastating.
Mm-hmm.
His responses to Lillian, what's her name? The feminist he's arguing with are not as convincing. And in fact, he actually often agrees with her and then still goes after her for some reason. It's very weird. Like it does strike one as like, what's that about? Like, and I haven't, the book that I need to read more of is we talked about the posthumous, you know, Revolt of the Elites, but there's also the even more posthumous
Women in
the Common Life.
It's got some gems in it.
Yeah. I have read it, but I read it so long ago that and I didn't read it with this book in mind. And so
when I read it, I'm just like, I feel like all of the other books are like kind of constructing a narrative, but Women in the Common Life is absent from that narrative. It's like very clearly like strung together.
Right. Well, yeah. I mean, I talk about how it feels like from liberals in the Russian Revolution to all the way to World of Nations, maybe even Haven and Heartless World. That's almost like one project.
Yeah.
Like, and then from Haven, you get this shift, and then you get what I like to call the theory books. Minimal Self, Culture of Narcissism, parts of Haven, and then you get the late theory books, which are almost historiographic and weirder. The Revolt of the Elites and the True and Only Heaven. Like, and I do periodize Lasch that way. Shallon's like, you don't need to periodize him. I'm like, I do think there's like massive differences in even his methodology in those first books of essays where he's critiquing, but, you know, I call him the frenemy of the New Left because there's elements of the New Left he actually does clearly respect, but like by the time you get to Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin in the 70s, he's just like, there's nothing left. Like whatever good in this is gone. But yeah, I think that's interesting. So, I think next time we meet, let's actually talk about the politics of the psyche chapter of Minimal Self. Let's go into detail with that. And because that is, to me, and maybe the chapter after it, the ideological assault on the ego. Those are the two, like, 1-2 punches where a lot of the stuff going on in Culture of Narcissism like becomes immediately clear, like in a way that it doesn't in the book itself. It's like, and that he's not blaming baby boomers for being what they are is actually really kind of important, and I think missed, because it's unclear to me, like you talked about, Lasch is not that authoritative. It's unclear to me that he thinks at this point when he's writing this book, by the time you get to True and Only Heaven, I think he does think there's an answer, but it's unclear to me that he thinks there's an answer to these problems here.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that there is. Oh, I'm looking through the wrong text. That makes sense.
Paper, baby.
Yeah, well, these are my notes.
Okay, fair.
I do have the paper copies downstairs, but I actually just moved back into my house.
It's okay. It's fine. Yeah. It's cool.
Yeah. So, he has this section at the end of chapter 2. The dominant conception of personality sees the self as a helpless victim of external circumstances. This is the view encouraged both by our 20th century experience of domination and by the many varieties of 20th century social thought that reach their climax in behaviorism. It is not a view likely to encourage either a revival of old-fashioned, acquisitive individualism, which presupposed far more confidence about the future than most people have today, or the kind of search for self-fulfillment celebrated by Klikak, Yankelovich, and other optimists.
There are people that there's all these people he mentions in this book and in Culture of Narcissism too, that I'm like, they have not maintained their cultural relevance, because I have no idea who you're talking about.
That's how I feel about these people. Genuine affirmation of the self, after all, insists on a core of selfhood not subject to environmental determination, even under extreme conditions. Self-affirmation remains a possibility precisely to the degree that an older conception of personality, rooted in Judeo-Christian traditions, has persisted alongside a behavioral or therapeutic conception. But this kind of self-affirmation, which remains a potential source of democratic renewal, has nothing in common with the current search for psychic survival, the varieties of which we must now examine in some detail.
Yeah, so he does think there's kind of a way out, but not totally. Right.
Yeah. It's like, I talk about it in the same way that I talk about the essay, Is Revolution Obsolete? Which ends in like, to oppose the anti-culture, we have to like go back into a time when culture existed. So it's like diving back into history to kind of like pick off the train of thought from where we left it. Which is discussed in the context of like, is narcissism a regression, basically? And it is an attempt at regression in the Freudian framing. It's an attempt at regression into like infancy, basically.
Right.
And like Lasch is simultaneously saying like that this regret, that he's simultaneously calling for like sort of a cultural regression at the same time as he's calling for people to grow up.
Yeah, that was my frustration with the Is Revolution Obsolete is similar, because I read that and I'm like, he's clearly saying it is not totally obsolete, but every definition of it that we have, including most analogous ones, he's also taken away from us. So it's like, what do you mean?
He's like, revolution will have to be very new and very old.
Right. It basically, yeah. It's like, but it can't be an insurrectionary revolution. You're not going to overthrow these states the way you did in 1917, or the way you're doing in the periphery now. Like, that's not going to be possible in the core. But also, when you guys use revolution for everything and then you left, it doesn't mean anything. And I'm like, okay, like, I remember arguing with Shallon when I first read that essay. I was like, is he saying revolution obsolete or not? Like, I mean, I think he says it is not obsolete, but I'm not sure because he did foreclose everything that I thought we meant by that word.
He's hedging his bets a little bit.
Right.
And he's hedging his bets in the minimal self, calling on the like reconstruction of a Judeo-Christian personality, because he's saying, you know, it's rooted in a Judeo-Christian personality, but it's not quite the same.
But that's this whole, like, the whole question you and I go back and forth. Like, we can never figure out if he was cryptically religious or not towards the end of his life. And there is no smoking gun. Like, I've asked people who knew him directly. There is no smoking gun. No one seems to know. And it's just like, okay, so this is the weird thing. We know that Lasch didn't become. We know that, for example, he was tied up in the Partisan Review and Commentary magazine, and when like Public Interest and all that started, that the neoconservatives reached out to him as another former Marxist, like turncoat, and he did not go. We know that happened.
He instead went to Tikkun, which is like Jewish, but like also pretty
religious, progressive, religious left magazine. Yeah, I mean, still, I mean, I read Tikkun until about 5 years ago. Like,
it's no longer a physical magazine, but I subscribe to the email list.
Well, I like ish Tikkun. I've always had a problem. But yeah, that's where he went, and I also noticed, you know, when you go back through, I've gone through so much. He worked for like the New York Review of Books, the London Review of Books, etc. You know what he did not do, and his essays are still largely uncollected, unfortunately. But I can't find him writing for conservative outlets except to chastise them, like, or to say they're misinterpreting him, or to, like, and that's true till very late. Like, and so the one thing that makes Revolt of the Elites interesting is like it's the one, well, and Women in the Common Life is the other, I guess. We don't have a clarification from him on like how it was misinterpreted or misused because he's dead. Like, it comes up posthumously. So what do you do with that? I personally don't know. Like, because in some ways, I think you're right to point out there's developments in this that are developments beyond what's in Culture of Narcissism. But he wrote this book to explain what he was trying to go on about in Culture of Narcissism.
No, I mean, I think the big intervention is that he talks about primary narcissism for the first time. But like that also clears up a lot of his errors in the Culture of Narcissism because it gives him a little more room to maneuver. So he's simultaneously changing his argument slightly and defending it.
He's like, he's explaining it while also defending it. Although I'm reading the back of this and I'm like, oh, Mark Crispin Miller, how stuff was out for you? Anyway, never read the back of Who Endorses Your Book 25, 30 years later.
Yeah, I do actually have a copy of Foucault's History of Sexuality, and on the back is Christopher Lasch. So that's the reason I picked up that particular copy.
Oh, it's interesting. Foucault is such a bugbear for me. I find that Lasch does use him, and he has a parallel, but like Lasch is a better scholar than Foucault.
Lasch is also like an American scholar and is more amenable to like American conditions.
Right. Whereas Foucault is all over the place, and I can't even tell. Like, I don't. By the end of Foucault's life, I'm like, is he an anarchist? Is he a neoliberal? I don't fucking know. Like it's. And the other thing about Foucault is Foucault takes literary sources at face value as historical fact, and it's actually crucial to some of his arguments in Crime and Punishment and History of Madness. Lasch was never that sloppy. But Lasch does see that what's interesting I think should make a lot of people uncomfortable. And this is something that's interesting in Foucault. And I think it's something that's interesting in Lasch too, is there is a truth to one of their points that the progressive liberal state does give birth to the control state, to the carceral state. Like there's no way that you can separate those two things out. Right.
I mean, the goal is the abolition of private life.
Right. Yes. Which is weirdly for all the mid 20th century talk about totalitarianism is a totalitarian project. Like, in a way that like Hegel is not. Like Hegel still believes in like the civic sphere is separate from the state. Like, for all you can throw a lot of shit at Hegel, that like talking to you, Karl Popper, Bentham is far more damaging. Also, every leftist who tends to be both a Marxist and a utilitarian understands neither. No. But anyway, I just got to throw that unrelated canard out, but I think Lasch would agree with me. It's interesting. Have you read a whole lot of Lester McIntyre?
No, I haven't.
It's interesting where there's overlaps with McIntyre, Lasch, and say someone like the post-Frankfurt for School Raymond Geist. And they all have very different responses to religion, but they all end up, and Raymond Geist is doing this in his book, Constant Think Like Liberal. He's like, look, I don't want religion back, but you have to admit that like Catholicism and like Orthodox Judaism, they're the only things that have robust answers to as a counter ideology to liberalism. And I'm like, and communism used to, but it doesn't anymore. And I think that's interesting. And I think that might be what Lasch is trying to get onto with his Protestant stuff. But it's less compelling. And I think the difference, if you were to cut the difference between Geist on one end and like wherever we put Lasch, and then like a Lester McIntyre on the other, because Lester McIntyre is loved by everybody, like paleo conservatives, all kinds of Catholic. Like, I'm pretty sure Patrick Deneen like is really into McIntyre, but and I know for a fact so Robin Mari is. But if you look at that spectrum, Lasch seems to be somewhere in the middle there. And he seems to, like, I do think, and he never mentions Max Weber. He does this through Reinhold Niebuhr and whatnot. But it does seem like he's like, the Protestant work ethic is right, and we can retro-engineer it, but this time separate bourgeois society from capitalism. That seems to be what he's arguing.
Yeah. I got my commentary on my thesis came back, and like a lot of the questions my advisor was asking, like, so you think Lasch is a liberal? And I was like, no, I don't. I'm not sure. I don't think so. And I think like, it is, he speaks to like trying to disentangle some elements of the creation of American liberalism from others, basically.
Right.
Which is like typically how socialism in the American context has viewed itself and articulated itself up until the present moment.
Well,
in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I was about to say, except the Marxists, historically, even the Marxists did try to like, hey, look,
like the communists were like, socialism is 21st century Americanism.
Right, exactly. Hey, like Karl Marx was writing for the Republican newspapers, which is, he was
sending letters to Abraham Lincoln.
Right, another fact. Like, so, and then for a little while, there was a tendency, I think you still see it, and two mutually opposed tendencies. One is platypus affiliated society. The other is who sees capitalism and liberalism and bourgeois society as separate, and they do this for different reasons than Lasch. But I think some of them do. They at least posit that as a possible answer to the question. And they see, they take the classical line as like, to finish the bourgeois revolutions would be the undo them into communism, right? And then there's the people like, say, Mac McManus, to a lesser degree Ben Burgess, who view this as like, well, no, I mean, basically Marxism is a more scientific development of classical liberalism that surpasses it, but is continuous with it. And there are people like me who are somewhere in between those two positions, but are like, who see Marxism is not liberal, but it comes out of liberalism directly in a response to the incoherence of both the the Anglo-American, but was back then just the English form of liberalism and the German idealist form of liberalism. Right?
It's a in a lot of ways, it's a counter-enlightenment philosophy, actually.
Right. Yeah. But
that is also an Enlightenment philosophy.
What's interesting about it is it's unlike the Romantics in its emphasis, So what I find interesting about Isaiah Berlin really like struggled to figure out where he was going to put Marxism in that Enlightenment counter Enlightenment. I think there's a book written 20 years ago, and it's not the best book on Marxism and post-Marxism, but it coined the phrase "the loyal opposition to modernity." As Marxism is like very modernist, but sees the flaws in it, and so it is counter Enlightenment, but also sees itself as like, but unlike the other counter Enlightenment philosophies, which sees themselves as fundamentally opposed to Enlightenment, Marxism goes like, no, but what you want could happen if it was fulfilled in this different way.
Is it worth it? Not yet.
Right. Exactly. Like there a lot of the current critiques that I think of Marx that kind of hit is like pointing out that like this assumptions of universal classness and all this do come out of like Hegelian logic, and they're harder and harder to justify in time. Which I think one thing that Lasch's relationship to Marxism is, unfortunately, with all my studying him, still profoundly unclear to me. Because he seems to have thought that Marxists have largely abandoned their project, and so he has to go elsewhere. And sometimes in his late writings, he talks real crap about Marxists, but he doesn't talk crap about Marx. But he also seems to assume some things about Marx that come out of like I don't know if he's getting it from Paul Sweezy or from Friedrich Pollock, but
the most explicit criticism of Marx is the criticism of like the supposed Marxist teleology of history, which happens in The True and Only Heaven. But that is, all things considered, pretty minor. And I think his most ringing endorsement of it is in The World of Nations. He writes about progress again, or I guess for the first time. And he takes Engels's definition of progress. The antagonistic character of true progress is and the false progress eliminates the viability and possibility of the true progress.
I.e., progress is dialectical and spiralic, not linear, and Whiggish. But by the time you get to True and Only Heaven, he seems to think like, but again, it's unclear if he's attributing like Marxist typologies of developmentalism to Marx or just to the Marxist tradition.
Well, a lot of the times when he's writing about it, he seems to be criticizing Beardism, which was very prominent. I mean, like I've been listening to like a lot of the old Firing Line interviews, actually. I was listening to one with like the Socialist Workers' Party, and like the vice presidential nominee is like talking to William F. Buckley, and it's like, have you ever read Charles Beard? He defines like how American life is, basically. So, Lasch was not kidding when he was writing about the popularity of Beardism on the left. Apparently, it was very prominent.
It's weird for me to think that, like, I think part of the problem, and this will be my last point, when we come to the New Left today, is we read a lot of the New Left through our understanding of the New Left post 1990s. But that means we actually don't understand it on its own terms. We understand it from like the particular parts of it that continued on into the university, like Angela Davis or Bell Hooks or whatever. We're not reading it from like the sectarian organizations or whatever. And even when we're doing that, we're reading them from like their successors now, like the Trotskyists that existed in the 1990s, the when like Althusser and the New Left Review as their obsessions or whatever. In the debates around the humanism, anti-humanism debates, etc. Like, and at the time, I don't think those were actually the primary debates. Those are actually debates. Like, yes, like the Brenner debate happens in 1983. Yes, the Barron and Sweezy debates happen in the 50s. But I think like we have bracketed out a lot of the actual theorists. Like, I had to do a whole lot of research, and when I was reading World of Nations, to figure out what the fuck he was going on about with the multiversity theory, because that has like fallen away from the stuff we talk about in the 1960s. The only other person who's commonly read today that mentions like Aaron Reich, and they're both critiques. Like, so like I had to do all this research to like go and find like, okay, who was actually even saying this? What were they saying? Like, so I realize in reading Lasch a lot of times we have, for a variety of reasons, some related to Cold War, some related to just academic survivors, reinterpreted a lot of the New Left in the light of like the Generation X left or even the Millennial left in ways that makes it very hard for us to understand what they actually thought in like the 70s and the lull period, or in the 80s when like people forgot that Marxists were even still around. Like, that is like the nadir. Because like, to put it in perspective, in 1947, the CPUSA is 70,000 people. In the 1960s, it's like 10,000. By 1980, it's 5,000, and it stays there. Like, it actually goes lower. I think it gets as low as like 2,000 or 3,000. If you added all the weird sectarian organizations, Trotskyists and Maoists together in the 1970s, the communist movement was over 1 million people in the United States alone. But they all were like, those organizations had like collapsed by 1980, and there's almost no history that tries to say not the genealogy of the organizations. People do that, but like, what happened to all the membership? Where did they go? What did they become? Well, if you really study them, a lot of them just became like normal standard Democrats.
Well, I mean, I think that's one thing about like the McGovern victory in 1972 in the nomination fight is, it was seen rightly or wrongly as a victory for the New Left, and it got a lot of former New Leftists into the Democratic Party.
Right.
In the same way that for
Bernie Sanders.
I was going to say Biden at this point. Like, there are so many people I know who are like in 2020, like Biden is the devil, who are now just like fervent Biden supporters, basically.
I saw that. I kind of saw this was coming when I saw the 7 Theses by Robert Brenner and Dylan Riley in the New Left Review, which I'm like, oh, we have fully recapitulated the New Left. And it's ending the same way. And it's ending the same way at the moment too. What is ironic about that is in 2020, when people hated Biden was making more actual progressive movements than he is now. Like,
yeah, at this point he's like, well, we got to do something about the solvency of Social Security. Like, that's this thing now.
And I'm like, oh, so we're back to Clintonism in 1990. It's like, that's it. It's like we
30 years. I hope you're ready for the articles about the radical period of the Biden deal, which is going to discuss the last 2 years.
Hopefully I will be dead at that point. Just like, just like I remember for 10 years being gaslit by the Democratic Party telling me that like, oh, we couldn't do anything because of because of the Republicans. And I'm like, for 2 years you had the largest supermajority in two of the three branches of government that any party has ever had since like the 1940s. What the fuck is wrong with you? Like, you just lost it all really fast. And you didn't have where there is some legitimacy that they didn't have the state control. They'd actually lost that when they dropped the Dean policy. But it's it's still sort of like amazing to me that they were able to write off that excuse now so much that it's like almost considered popular. Uh, uh, it's like almost popular history at this point that's what happened, and that's definitely popular history about like I think people have gone back to hating third wayism again, except that they try to like exempt Obama as a third way figure, and they're finally really coming around to. But Biden's still that guy. Like, any concessions made were under the duress of COVID. Like, and it seems completely scuttled at this point. Like, some of it's not his fault, to be fair, but I don't know. I don't know what lessons we're going to take away from this, and I have no idea what the like Democratic Party looks like in 5 years at all. I got no idea. The one thing
I have no idea what the Republican Party looks like in 5 years.
Me either. I don't think it's Trumpism, but I don't know what it is. Like, I think they got rebuked on Trumpism and the Supreme Court, although the Supreme Court's not going to go away anytime real soon. But I have no idea what I don't think it looks better. Like, and so, but I will tell you the Obama strategy seems to be sui generis to Obama. And what I mean by that, Kamala Harris and Laura Lightfoot are basically Obamas. They were people with legal backgrounds, and Kamala Harris and Laura Lightfoot's case, prosecutorial backgrounds that were ciphers that both the conservative and progressive elements of their party could project upon. And in trying to rule in ways that satisfy all those constituencies, they are massively unpopular with all of them. And so I think that pathway may be closed off. Now, going to say that's the end of progressivism. And God, I actually kind of wish it was, but I don't think it is. But I do think like the whole just find a bunch of people who fit an identity but maybe come from a prosecutorial background to appease the conservatives is not going to work. And I don't know what is going to work, because the idea,
except for Eric Adams. No, I'm joking.
But I don't know what is going to. I don't know what is going to work, because the idea that most Democrats, they seem to think that they could literally survive off of a coalition of mostly black women. And I'm like, that's half of 14% of the population.
I mean, young people like we don't vote that much, but we do vote overwhelmingly
Democratic. Yeah.
And there's no signs of that stopping, actually.
No, it's not changing with millennials either. Like,
they're not getting more conservative as they age.
If people stop voting for Democrats, it's usually because they're moving left. Although I do have my theory, Elijah, that actually is a complication of this. Even a lot of right-wingism right now, like, presents itself as left-wing.
Yeah.
Like
MAGA communism, you mean?
Yeah, but that's the most ludicrous form of it, though. But like, there's a whole lot of recuperative cultural stuff I think Gen Zers are going to be open to, that as long as it's not wearing a MAGA hat, might fly.
I don't know. I mean, I think people my age are kind of checked out.
Well, I mean, yes, but you're also 20-something.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, but like, yeah, I mean, it'll be interesting to see.
Do you think you guys are going to be like Gen Xers, where like most of the generation never votes?
No, I think voting is, everybody votes, or lots of people vote. They just like vote Democrat and don't care.
Right. So They vote D, but it's basically the same as not voting.
Yeah, they're just like, oh, the Republican is.
I think we lost Elijah.
Yeah, okay, I'm back.
Okay.
They vote, but like they're like the Republican is evil, so I just vote for whoever the Democrat is. Which I mean, I think is like a pretty reasonable way of making a selection. Republicans are evil. Democrats often are too.
So to say, the perversity of that though is like you're ensuring that the side you have, like people like Republicans will just realize that they have to do the Ackerman plan, go back into the Democratic Party stealth-wise and break it up at the national level.
It's gonna be so awesome in like 20 years when if my like generation and the millennials continue voting at our rates, we're gonna have entryism not only from the left but also from the right.
Right. It's gonna be like Chicago Park. Actually, Chicago's our future. It's gonna be like the entire spectrum of politics from wackadoo to wackadoo the other way is gonna be represented.
No, I think I know New York better, but it's like in the recent mayoral elections, it's like left winger who does union busting, former police guy who loves killing rats and believes that crystals power New York City's swagger. And it's not gonna be a boot stomping on your face forever and ever. It's gonna be a rare crystal being dropped from up high forever and ever.
Yes, a rare crystal being carpet bombed upon you by some drone.
It's perfect. It's exactly the future we deserve.
And then like the red states are going to basically outlaw everything in the name of free speech.
Yeah, it's going to be like this college in like North Idaho that there's like an article about it today. It's like the Coeur d'Alene community college, which was
I've been there.
It was taken over by like a bunch of MAGA people, and now it's like losing its accreditation because they're just banning them teaching anything.
That's happening in Florida, like as a whole state.
Yeah.
Like I read that bill that they passed. And I'm like, I think they're gonna lose. I think a whole lot of academics are just gonna leave. Like,
yeah,
it's wild. I mean, the other thing is like they're doing Gramscian cultural politics in an institution that is already fracturing, fraying, and using as cultural relevance. So I don't know.
Without understanding Gramsci and using fake quotes that they themselves have invented.
Oh yes. Yeah. What they're actually doing is an idiot's form of Mosca. But you know, I mean, my weird thing about the thing I love about just generation of weird anti-communists who blame communists for everything liberals have ever done, including like Disney. I never thought you could say first as tragedy, then as farce about the Birchers.
It's awesome. It's so cool.
but that's basically what a lot of Florida politics is.
Yeah. I love how they've like made themselves a one-party state and they're deciding to just like destroy the education system that has no impact on the governance of the state with their power.
It's so bizarre to me. And I was like, and they're also talking about like banning. Did you see this bill that might actually get passed that like bans any party that had any relationship to slavery? So it bans Democrats.
That's so cool. That's the funniest possible. That's so great.
And they like justify it like, how do you like your cancel culture now? And they know it's going to get thrown out. And I'm
that's
like,
so funny.
And I'm just like, oh my God. Because I do wonder when people are like, oh, DeSantis is like the competent Trump. I'm like, is he though?
He's completely incompetent. And he's also like
not
3 feet
charismatic
platform shoes.
And what we're learning is trolling the libs as an entire political philosophy, which Trumpism actually wasn't quite that.
No, it was do that. And then also like, I mean, you're seeing like I don't know how this is possible, but you have first as tragedy, then as farce now with like Trump politics. Where like in 2016, he was like, we're going to like end trade. We're going to like pull out of the foreign wars and we're going to unleash unprecedented prosperity. And he just released like his platform and like these videos. And like the first video was like, we're making mercantilism for the 21st century. And then the second video is we're doing a great modernization initiative with freedom cities of privately owned cities on federal land that have flying cars. So it's like amazing. I mean, it's just like,
so, I mean, so it's both populism and going back to libertarian seasteading.
yeah, they're like, we need venture democracy.
Oh, someone should stop this kid. This 74-year-old from eating Brad the Long. Yeah, this is. I mean, you kind of. People ask me why I'm obsessed with Lasch, and I am trying to bring in more. I'm actually trying to bring in more high theory. The one thing I'm trying to do also with these Lasch conversations, and also with like Michael Sandel conversations, is even though Sandel's a Harvard philosopher, they actually talk in a way normal people understand. Yeah. We kind of don't. like I even had a very educated friend of mine who's educated in the humanities go like, your show like claims to be for the people. I'm like, actually, no, I don't claim to be for the people. Let's actually be honest. I am like so the Velvet Underground of left-wing shows. But
I don't know. We spent most of this show talking about like Disney and K-pop.
That's true.
Not exactly engaging in high theory here.
Well, have you read Zizek? That's supposedly high theory.
Okay. Okay.
but in all seriousness, like, I do think we need to engage with contemporary political thought outside of the radical European and American university tradition. Because sometimes they actually agree with us. And what is interesting is some of the most interesting theorists right now, like Bung Chul Han, he does that. Like he actually is like reading like both, Baudrillard and like Charles Taylor and like Michael Sandel and Richard Sennett and like, Chinese philosophy. And I'm like, we should be like, yes, there's this Marxological project, but like, if you think you win an argument on policy based off Marxology, you're kind of a crazy person, I think. Like, so it's like I was not expecting the degrowth debates to right now to be like half about Marxology. Like that's, as a person who has spent way too much of his life in Marxology and can argue a whole lot of points, that's weird. That's really strange.
Especially because like on that point, it's just like more important to be like, okay, like, does this work?
Right.
It's like a political prescription. It's not like,
like, was Marx actually against historical materialism because of a letter he wrote to Vera Sirlik, which yes, that exists, but also it's a much more complicated question that I think either side of that debate is framing it. But also, it doesn't settle shit about what we should do about environmental stuff.
Yeah.
Like, like I'm just like, that's a weird way to try to win this debate.
Did you read that article in the like most recent New Left review about the Green New Deal?
Which one?
Or it was actually not in the most recent one. It was like the January one, December.
No, I don't think I did.
It was like the IRA is the Green New Deal, basically. Like this is the culmination. And I read it and I was like, it's not engaging with like the central thing that the IRA is, which is like, it's not the Green New Deal. It's like the given alternative, which doesn't do any of like the social engineering that the Green New Deal promises.
Oh, the Inflation Reduction Act? It doesn't even do what we promised to do in the Paris Accords. Like, why is the New Left Review like kissing the Democrats' ass? What is that about?
I don't know. I
mean, I guess they can't kiss labor's ass anymore, but like, Brit, go home. Brit, go home. All right, I'm done. You're just making me hate the English even more.
Yeah. We have to have pity on them now. They have a higher poverty rate than we do.
They've always had a higher poverty rate than we do.
Oh, really? I thought that was a new thing.
It's been a thing for about 10 years. It's actually dramatically higher than we do. Like,
they're the only country in the like the G20 that had like a negative growth rate last year.
Yeah, and they're the only, and it's predicted to have one more severe than anything happening in Russia.
No, it's amazing. Britain has just like destroyed itself in the past like 5 years.
Basically, we just saw somebody who has been benefiting from a sweet deal and being allowed to keep their hegemonic delusions just shoot itself in the foot, lose its currency sovereignty, and also like its relevance to the world stage. And the only thing that's going to save it is like the Americans kind of speak your language and don't totally hate you.
Yeah, they're like, please, America, can we have like a free trade deals that you, with your like better industrial capacity, can flood our market with cheap.
And then we can be like, finally, we have airstrip 1.
Yeah,
like
perfect.
like we're just gonna pave Manchester as part of this deal, and I'm waiting for like Australia and Canada to be like, okay, now I know we you've given us, you know, all but independence, but maybe it's time for us just to say, I don't want to be like Elizabeth was cool, but you guys aren't worth dealing with Charles. Goodbye. Like that probably won't happen, but this is the first time where I think it could.
Yeah.
Like, you know, the Canadians, I think they need their cultural distinction from the U.S. too much to do that. But it's man, I'm really gonna piss off. I have a lot of Canadian and English listeners. I don't know why I always aim for them so hard. Maybe they're masochist, I think, because they're like 30% of my audience.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
I'm leaving all this in. This is going in unedited.
Yeah.
Thank you, Elijah. Since I don't want to get you canceled for anti-British bigotry. Actually, I like the Scots and the Northern Irish. They're okay.
Getting canceled for anti-British bigotry would promote my career aspirations, frankly.
Well, I mean, like,
I'm just joking.
Are they going to be relevant anymore? Like, I mean, the one thing I can say about it, at least we're getting good labor up. A friend of mine was like, "Why is Britain having so much more labor upheaval than America? Why aren't American unions do that?" I'm like, Britain's much more desperate.
Yeah.
Are you not looking at the numbers right now? Like it looks real dire. I have friends who are like, "I'm going to move to Britain." I'm like, "No, you do not. No, don't move to Britain right now. You can vacation in Britain because it's finally cheap, but don't move there." Like, oh my God, I'm basically positing the UK's future is basically like the Caribbean.
They're both islands.
They did it first. They did it to the Caribbean first. It's almost fair. All right. British people don't hate me. I don't mean everything that I say, but you guys really should do something about your world status because it looks pretty dire right now.
Sir Cure will save them.
Oh, man. Stommer to the rescue. All right, and on that depressing note, I've even bummed out myself. I'm going to end. Goodbye.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for having me. See you in a month and a half or so.